Okay, so I wanted to be able to share today about where diabetes comes from. For whatever reason, I don't think very many people are talking about this, and I think that is ridiculous. And what is shared about the origins of diabetes, where diabetes comes from, a lot of it is not true. So I wanted to take a second today to talk about diabetes, where it comes from, how do we get it? And I think with an understanding of where it comes from, we're going to be better equipped to be able to treat it, to be able to prevent it. But first, we need to know where exactly that it comes from. So it comes from one of the worst pieces of advice of all time. There are so many things that we're told that we just accept and understand as truths for the rest of our lives. And a lot of this is not true. So one of the ones that I wanted to talk to you about today is eat a balanced diet. This is one of the worst pieces of advice that you could ever give another human being, let alone another human being with diabetes, or somebody who wants to prevent diabetes. Eating a balanced diet means that you're going to be mixing macronutrients, your fats, your proteins, your carbohydrates. You're going to have 3 to 5 well-balanced meals throughout the day. And this is one of the worst pieces of advice. There's nothing true about this statement whatsoever. And a balanced diet is something that is completely inappropriate to our biology. It's not something that we're designed to eat. So the two macronutrients that I really wanted to focus on are fats and carbohydrates, and why they should never be consumed together or even remotely close to each other. When they are eaten together, you activate something called the Randle Cycle. What happens when the Randle Cycle is activated is one of the most outrageous amounts of inflammation and immune system activation that destroy the pancreas, that ruin our body's ability to produce insulin and control our blood sugars, and then the insulin resistance cascade begins. Diabetes begins because of the activation of Randle Cycle, because we're mixing macronutrients together. We're mixing fats and carbohydrates together. This is something that if you just take a second, you look into the natural world, out of all things that are good and natural in the world, you're never going to find a food that is a mixture of fats and carbohydrates, ever. The only place you're going to find a mixture of fats and carbohydrates is in breast milk, in a food that is designed to make an organism as fat as possible, as fast as possible. And here we are, we do it to every meal. We say to our natural world, you're not good enough. You don't taste good enough right now. I'm going to make you taste better. So we combine fats and carbohydrates together to make these hyper palatable experiences that make us feel good. Eating turns into this experience that subserves the pleasure centers of our brain. It's not eating to live, it's living to eat. This mixture of fat and proteins, if you just think about it, a high carbohydrate meal like a baked potato, we're not going to overeat a baked potato. We're not going to overeat cocoa. We're not going to overeat, coffee with sugar in it. We need to make these simple meals a hyper palatable experience that brings joy and pleasure. And so we add butter to the baked potato. We add sugar to the chocolate, and we add cream to our sweet coffee to make these enjoyable, hyper palatable experiences. And so you could think about it from the perspective of like, what causes diabetes? What causes these hyper palatable experiences? And from there, I think we could take a really quick look and understand that it is trauma. It is emotional stresses and mental stresses, mental fatigue, lack of connection to anything good, lack of culture, language loss, all of these different things that are driving this opportunity for us. Every time we eat, we're going to be happy. Every time we eat, we're going to have a separation from the stresses and from the traumas, and we're going to feel good. And so then there becomes a drive to make every meal hyper palatable, combine all of the fats with all of the carbohydrates to make this super delicious, joyful experience. And it's these traumas and the history, the discrimination, the racism, all of these experiences that are creating the space for the Randle Cycle to be continuously overactive. The real big issue, one of the big issues that we can understand just with this perspective now, is that when you have a mixture of fats and carbohydrates, without even getting into the Randle Cycle, without even getting into the science of what is actually happening, you could just look at a hyper palatable meal. You're going to eat too much. Your energy balance is off. You have way too much energy. You're not able to expend it all. So all of that extra energy is repackaged and stored as fat. And so fat storage, obesity, metabolic syndrome, fatness. One of the things we need to realize is your fat is a recognized endocrine organ. It controls and it secretes hormones. One of the things that your fat does is create these pro-inflammatory cells called adipokines. And adipokines attract your immune system. They attract your immune system inappropriately. So there's nothing there for your immune system to kill, yet it's attracted anyways. So your immune system is killing something that's not actually there. And so, God forbid, this happens around your pancreas, where there's adipokines being created around your pancreas. Your immune system goes to kill something that's not there. What is there is your pancreas, and the pancreatic islet cells are destroyed. The site where insulin is produced is diminished. And when your pancreas is not able to make insulin properly anymore, blood sugar stays high. And when blood sugar stays high for too long, insulin resistance cascade begins, until your liver is becoming insulin resistant and constantly spewing out sugar all the while you're eating it. And you just get to this point where there's no way your pancreas can ever make enough insulin to control your blood sugar. So then your A1Cs start to rise and you become pre-diabetic, and then you become diabetic and dependent on exogenous insulin and metformin and SGLT2 inhibitors, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so we can have a fair understanding of how diabetes is just because of mixing fat carbohydrates together, making hyperpalatable meals, and just overeating and being over fat or overweight and having excessive adiposity, creating these adipokines and the inappropriate immune activation. That's easy to understand, but that's not the only thing. So if I take you back to Philip Randall in the late 1960s, who was able to identify that in your body, you're either only burning fats or you're burning carbohydrates. They both cancel each other out, meaning when you're burning sugar, you're not allowed to burn fat. When you're burning fat, you're not allowed to burn sugar. So I wanted us to be able to totally just take a second, nerd out on this. For most of us, it might just sound like wah, 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 but like whatever. I'm going to do it anyway because it's what I like to do. So here in the blue area, you have everything that is inside of your blood, and the orange area is what is inside of your cells, and then the green area is what's inside the mitochondria. So this is how energy is taken from your blood, whether that's energy sourced from glucose or from long chain fatty acids or from fats. And so this chart is to show us this is the origin of diabetes. This is where it comes from. So if we could understand this chart, if you could follow along for the next minute, we will have a fair understanding of where diabetes comes from. Literally the most morbid disease that has ever affected our species. Glucose in your blood is brought into the cell by a GLUT4 transporter. That's what brings it into the cell, and the glucose 6-phosphate, fructose 6-phosphate is converted into fructose 1,6-biphosphate by phosphofructokinase 1, phosphofructokinase 2. That is converted into pyruvate. See what I mean? Wah, wah, wah. But then the pyruvate is sent into the mitochondria, where it is converted by pyruvate dehydrogenase into acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is what the mitochondria uses to create the energy for the cell, the ATP that the cell needs. And as a result of that, there's a pooling of citrate that diffuses from the mitochondria into the cytosol, where it is converted back into acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA carboxylase, an enzyme breaks that down into malonyl-CoA. This is what we need to remember. Malonyl-CoA, as indicated by the blockades CPT1. CPT1 is what takes long-chain fatty acetyl-CoA molecules from the cell into the mitochondria. So when CPT1 is blocked, that long-chain fatty acetyl-CoA is not allowed to get into the mitochondria. It stays within the cell. The longer it stays there, it will just be converted into triglycerides. That's fat storage. That's obesity, metabolic syndrome, fatness, adipokines, inappropriate activation of immune system, and diabetes, and the whole insulin resistance cascade. You could think about it this way. If you're having a baked potato, you're having a lot of sugar, your blood sugar is going to increase. That is a carbohydrate dominant meal. And so the carbohydrates are going to be used by the cell. And as a result of those carbohydrates being used by the cell, the fat is blocked off. So any amount of butter that's added to the potato is going to be sent directly to fat storage. Think about it that way. So you could think about it this way. Take a baked potato, a high carbohydrate meal, you're glucose dominant, burning all the sugar, the fats are blocked off. Any amount of fat that you add to that baked potato is going directly to fat storage. Think about it that way. And so when you're looking at a meal, when you're sitting in front of a meal, measure the amount of fat in that carbohydrate dominant meal that is going to be sent directly, exclusively to fat storage in the form of triacylglycerides. It's a really fun exercise to think about. But I wanted to be able to explain the other side of things, because this is where it gets really fun. So this is looking at the long chain fatty acids that are inside of your blood. So when your body is burning largely fat dominant, you get a transporter called CD36. Those long chain fatty acetyl-CoA molecules are brought into the mitochondria thanks to CPT1, undergoes beta oxidation into acetyl-CoA. The pooling of citrate blocks pyruvate dehydrogenase. So at the level of the mitochondria, within the mitochondria, pyruvate is not allowed to be converted into acetyl-CoA because pyruvate dehydrogenase is blocked. And so the ability to burn sugar is blocked at the level of the mitochondria. The pooling of citrate diffuses into the cytosol, and that pooling of citrate is going to block within the level of the cell phosphofructokinase 1 and 2. So if there is sugar that's being allowed into the cell, it is not going to be allowed to be burned. It's going to be sent into glycogen stores. It's going to be sent into fat storage. And because most of us, honestly, rocking full glycogen capacity all day long. So any excess glycogen that is being made is going to be going directly into fat storage. So, or repackaged as triglycerides and then sent to fat storage. Anyways, this pooling of citrate doesn't just block the sugar from being able to be utilized within the cell. It blocks GLUT4 from being able to even allow sugar to enter into the cell. So the sugar is forced to stay in your blood. And when your blood sugar is elevated, when it stays too high for too long, that's when the damage occurs. So enter the second worst quote of all time. The second worst quote of all time is eat a little bit of fat with that high sugar meal because it slows the absorption of the sugar, or it lowers the glycemic index, lowers the glycemic load, and blood sugar won't peak so high. And it's just the lies that we've been fed is disgusting. So long story short, when you're burning fats for fuel, not allowed to burn sugars. The sugar is not even allowed to enter the cell. And when the sugar is not allowed to enter the cell, sugar stays in your blood and you could see in our cardiovascular disease video we did earlier, sugar is the primary generator and driver of cardiovascular disease, of heart attacks and strokes and vascular dementia. It's because of sugar inside of your blood. And so thankfully, unfortunately, when we're utilizing fat as a source of fuel and combining that fat with glucose, the sugar is not allowed in. Sugar stays in your blood, causes damage. The insulin resistance cascade begins, and we have diabetes. So this mixing of macronutrients, given these two charts and hopefully a fair understanding of it now, is a really bad place for our body to be. We're either burning one or the other. There's a choice that needs to be made. But before we get to that choice, I wanted to be able to explain to you is that, this is not all that bad. Either we're burning fats or sugars. This is great because some of us can remain within this flux. Like when we're burning glucose as a source of fuel, and we have a little bit of fats with that meal. The fat is blockaded and it's turned into triacylglycerides, and those can be burned if you're conducting any amount of exercise, especially cardiovascular exercise. You're just going to burn the triacylglycerides. You're going to burn all of the extra fats. It's not all just going to necessarily go to storage. And the same thing when you're burning fats as a source of fuel, you have a little bit of sugar with that, a little bit of carbohydrates with that. Those are blocked off, right? And so everything is just going to be sent into storage, glycogen stores. And if you have capacity within your glycogen stores because you're exercising, if you have a little bit of space within your glycogen stores, that's fine. That's where that sugar is going to go. And this is okay. So you can kind of remain in a little bit of flux. It's fairly sensitive, but most of us are not there. Most of us are in a state where we have too much fats and too much sugar inside of our blood all the time. And when that happens, they both cancel each other out. And when they both cancel each other out, there's no energy getting into the mitochondria. And so when that happens, you are effectively lowering the redox potential of the mitochondria. And what happens when you lower the redox potential of the mitochondria is this is the stage where diabetes is created. Up until now, you have overeating from hyperpalatable foods and obesity and adipokines, inappropriate activation of your immune system, and destruction of beta islet cells. And so there you go, diabetes. That's fair. But then you have this, in addition to that, the opportunity for us to remain in this flux. The problem being that we don't exercise. So any amount of fat that's added to a high carbohydrate meal is just turned into triglycerides, and any additional sugars that's eaten with a high fat meal is turned into glycogen, which is turned into just repackaged as triglycerides and stored as fat. And so that makes the situation even worse. And so even with that, we could understand, oh, okay, there's diabetes. That's what causes it. It's just, opportunity for fatness. It's not that simple. Yeah, because most of us are not within that state. We're having too much sugar and too much fat all at the same time. And we are activating the Randle cycle to the point where no substrate is allowed to get to the mitochondria, and the redox potential of the mitochondria is reduced. And every time you reduce the redox potential of the mitochondria, so this is what happens. You have ADP inside of the mitochondria, adenosine diphosphate, that's bound to a phosphate ion to create ATP, adenosine triphosphate, that is then sent out through the ATP synthase flywheel to subserve as the energy substrate that the cell needs to survive. But what happens when the redox potential of the mitochondria is lowered because it's not getting enough substrate, it's not getting enough energy that it needs, enough acetyl-CoA, what happens is you get this accumulation of phosphate ions because there's no ADP to bind to, so you get this accumulation of phosphate ions that then diffuse through the membranes into the intra and extracellular space, where they phosphorylize your immune system and mast cells. Phosphorylation is activation. So in your body, you get all these pro-inflammatory cytokines all over your body floating around inert. They're not doing anything. They're alive, but they're not activated yet. The activation process is called phosphorylation, where a phosphate ion binds to it and activates it, turns it on, and then that pro-inflammatory cytokine attracts your immune system and says, hey, there's an infection here. Come kill it now. And so what happens is you get a cytokine storm where all of these cytokines are being activated. And again, God forbid this happens around your pancreas, where you get this activation of your immune system, goes over there to kill a pathogen, but there's no pathogen there. It's your pancreas. It doesn't matter. Kill it. And so your immune system destroys your pancreas, lowers the ability for your pancreas to make insulin, keeping your blood sugar elevated for too long. And that elevated levels of blood sugar is going to drive insulin resistance, and the insulin resistance cascade begins until you're diabetic. So lowering the redox potential of the mitochondria is at the root of what causes diabetes, and it's the overactivation of the Randle cycle by mixing macronutrients, by mixing fats and carbohydrates together. This is where diabetes comes from. So yeah, it's just really crazy to think that every time you eat a balanced meal, every time you mix fats and carbohydrates together, you are activating a cytokine storm every time you eat a balanced meal. Think about it that way, because that's actually what's happening. And there's just no possible way that I can ever make a video without calling out vegetable oils. So 2-AG and 4-H&E, the oxidative linoleic acid metabolites found in vegetable oils, or what vegetable oils are made of, will break PDH. So if we go back to Philip Randall, we look at this process where we are burning sugars as a source of fuel, and we have vegetable oils with that. That PDH in the mitochondria, pyruvate dehydrogenase, that converts the pyruvate into acetyl-CoA to be burned within the mitochondria, that PDH is broken. Pyruvate not allowed into the mitochondria, and fats not allowed to be burned, lowering of the reactive oxidative potential of the mitochondria again. This is why vegetable oils should just be removed from our shelves and not allowed in our communities. And there needs to be authentic education happening to be able to teach us how to deal with these issues, how to help with diabetes, which is a really good segue into the real purpose of this video, to identify a choice that we have to make. You're either burning high carbohydrate and low fat, or you're using low carbohydrate and high fat as a way to control diabetes, both of which work very well. I mean, there's so much anecdote, literature, and mechanisms to show how successful high carbohydrate and low fat diets are to be able to ameliorate diabetes. The only problem with those is that they're very severely nutritionally deficient. There's a lot of deficiencies that you could run into engaging in that way of eating. So there's careful supplementation that is necessary. And it's that supplementation that comes with an incredible toxic load, mainly heavy metals. And so the alternative to that, the high fat, low carbohydrate, very low carbohydrate or no carbohydrate, please, option that we have is ancestrally consistent. It's something that our species has been doing for hundreds of thousands of years and is a way of eating that is not going to result in nutritional deficiencies. We can get all of the nutrition that we need from the flesh and fat of ruminant animals like we have since the origin of our species. So there's a decision to make. That's kind of interesting to think about, the choice that we all have to make if we want to be able to heal from the diabetes. And that's one of the biggest issues, is to think about if we want to even be able to make that decision. You know, hilariously, November is Diabetes Awareness Month in Canada anyways, I guess. And eating a balanced diet appears to be a core principle created by and espoused by dietetics, the organizations and associations responsible for teaching us how to eat. Teaching us how to eat a balanced diet is doing nothing but poisoning us and perpetuating disease. So I would say that now is the time, if we want to be able to ever choose a more crucial time to listen to our ancestors, to listen to the land itself and begin to eat like according to our biological design, now is the time to do it. So whenever we want to identify what causes diabetes, where does diabetes comes from, I hope now you have a pretty good idea where it comes from. And I hope now you have a pretty fair skepticism as to who we are getting nutritional advice from, who is responsible for controlling the types of foods that we eat, and how are those decisions being made, and to begin questioning it, because everywhere that I look, the opportunity for dietetics to be able to teach Indigenous people how to eat is so incredibly flawed. And I will sit down with anybody any day to discuss any disagreements in any of the content that we have. And more often than not, I do find myself in these conversations, and for me, they are really fun to have. So, I welcome that. But here's a good shout out to the origins of diabetes. Where does it actually come from? How does it develop? And what can we do about it then? Now that we know where it comes from, how do we get better at treating it? How do we get better at preventing it? That was super fun. Maybe this recording freaking worked. I don't know how many times I've done this. Get so heated every time anyways. Now, Obama.